Hello, we are live, and we are back with the next chapter of our Deity chart Mythstreams. And today is the beginning of a very large chapter because this is the chapter involving Zeus and what has come to be known as the Sky Father, colloquially speaking. Of course, we've already done an episode on Dyఔws Pitar of the Rig Veda, of the Vedas, the god who is the sky. And we explained how, much more so in terms of his actual existing myths and his role in the pantheon, Dyఔws is equivalent to Uranos, the god who is the embodied sky in the Greek pantheon and other pantheons. And so that should tell you from the start that there is a disjunction in our model of how these things work, how the Indo-European branch is developed, in that there is this famous linguistic name connection between Zeus and Dyaush, but we are arguing that there is a complete disjunction, or rather we should say a significant major disjunction between Zeus and Dyaush Pitar in terms of what god type they actually are and what mythos they have. So this implies that there was a shifting of the name in a sense, and that is one of the main things that results in what we see now, with Dyaush actually being the Uranos type, but Zeus being a different type. And so from that, we have to argue that there is a much stronger case for Zeus being a different type. So what is that type if he is not the embodied sky? Well, he is the sovereign. He is specifically the totality sovereign, but there is a strong emphasis on his role as the sovereign of day, of the day-lit sky, of the shining light of sky. But he is not the embodied sky itself, at least in a narrow sense, except for in his role as the totality of encompassing the Godhead in a way. He can be everything. But he is not this narrowed God who is the sort of resigned God who is the sky in the background. That instead is the Uranos/Dyaush type. So this concept of the sovereign god we went into last time with Varuna, and the concept of Mitra Varuna, this duality of the two halves, the two sides, or the duo of two sovereign gods who make up the ideal sovereign god. When they work together, when they combine, they are like two sides of the sovereign of the gods. But Varuna is this more dark night sky associated ruling deity, and also ruler of the waters, more tumultuous in that sense, more terrible in Dumézil's wording. And so we explained how Varuna, that first half of the sovereign, actually aligns with the Poseidon god, the Poseidon role, much more. And that leaves Mitra, the other half of the sovereign, but nonetheless he embodies the sovereign, just as Varuna does in his own way. But Mitra is then associated with the daylit sky, with the second half of the cosmic cycle. So therefore he has this latterness to him, this late arrivingness, this sense that everything, that all the Godhead, all the sovereignty that came before him, all of the powers kind of flow into and culminate in the Mitra type generally. You see this when you sort of understand and reconstruct the type in all the branches. That is to say, in the Vedas themselves, Mitra is sort of pushed aside, and Dumézil himself goes into how Mitra is sort of has been sort of disarmed. He has been turned into a more narrow god of the judicial, of the contract, of peace and friendship, and therefore he is not sort of a combatant. And this shows up in the Rig Veda itself because there's only one hymn to Mitra alone as his own individual god. There are multiple hymns to Mitra Varuna as this combined concept of the sovereign duality, but there is only one to Mitra himself. So this already shows us that within that tradition, Mitra is sort of has been sort of pushed aside. However, there is evidence to show that this was not necessarily the case in other branches for the type and on the Proto-Indo-European level, because for one thing, we have the Avestan evidence right next door in the Iranic evidence. We can compare the Iranic Avestan hymns to the Vedic ones, and we find that the hymn to Mithra in the Avesta is, I think, it is one of the longest, if not the longest, hymns in the Avesta, and so it is clearly incredibly important. Mithra has a very important high position in the Avesta. There are some versions of the tradition. There are some traditions within the Iranic sphere. Perhaps it's the Zurvanite one where Mithra even is like the mediator between Ahura Mazda and Ahriman. So he has this very powerful role in that respect. This is very different from what we have of the minimal evidence in the Rig Veda for Mitra working on his own. And so it kind of suggests that that the Mitra type may have been just diminished in the Vedic material. So the other thing, before we go further into that I want to point out is that essentially when trying to understand Zeus, for the most part, people reach for the Vedic material and reach for the established types within the Vedas. And because of what I just explained, that the Mitra type has potentially and seemingly been diminished, been sort of pushed slightly out of the picture as his own god, because of that, scholars and lay people alike end up not seeing the full picture of what the pantheon may have been originally, and they don't see the full picture of who the Mitra type is. So therefore, they will see a very prominent, very elevated Indra type, the Thunderer. They will see Dyέως bearing the same name as Zeus, but having a seemingly different roles than Zeus. And it ends up that most people will sort of have the immediate conclusion that Zeus must equate somehow to either Indra or Dyέως, right? These are what you hear for the most part, that it seems that Zeus has the thunderbolt, and so he perhaps is a different changed version of Indra, or Zeus shares a linguistic root with Dyέως, therefore he must connect somehow fundamentally to Dyέως. But what I want to suggest is that there is much more evidence when you reconstruct what has happened with the pantheon and you reconstruct the other branches, then you can start to see what really happened, and that there's this sovereign type, Mitra Varuna, going back to Proto-Indo-European, and it is the Mitra side of that duality that connects most of all to Zeus, although there is, because of the overlap of Mitra and Varuna, there is Mitra and Varuna material that can parallel Zeus, and Zeus as this culminating totality can sort of be a Mitra Varuna in one, while at the same time having the strongest mythic equivalence with the Mitra type. And so the core takeaway from that is that people usually just don't understand the Mitra type because of the diminishing that has happened in the Vedic tradition of Mitra that causes this confusion. And so I want to encourage and challenge people to try to go farther and to actually understand the Mitra type before making their conclusions about who Zeus might be, because I think it is a problem with people, once again, just not really understanding Mitra and the Mitra type, and how that might play out. When you do that, the answers start to come through, I think, in a much clearer picture of who Zeus was and is. And so I want to first, along with that, point to a couple scholars, big, major Indo-European scholars who have actually pointed in this direction. It is sort of a fallacy to think that nobody has realized that there is this Mitraic or Mitra-Varuna connection to Zeus, because in fact both Georges Dumézil and M.L. West, perhaps the two biggest names you can think of in Indo-European studies, have both suggested this direction, without making an absolute statement about it. They have suggested that there is this curious alignment of Zeus to the sovereign Mitra-Varuna and even to Mitra himself. Okay, so it's I want to emphasize, this is not just me spewing and making this up, that Mitra is this stronger candidate for Zeus. It is in fact supported within serious scholars who have looked really closely at the material. So first of all, I want to pull up a page from Georges Dumézil's Mitra-Varuna, once again, on this topic, and to show you a bit of what I'm talking about. Okay, so I'll find the passage here. So over on the right side here, we have a discussion of Uranos and Zeus. And Dumézil starts in this passage, this sort of confusing passage, or he sort of goes back and forth. He begins to ask the question about, okay, if Uranos is Varuna, so to frame this, Dumézil believed at this time that Uranos was the strongest candidate, equal to Varuna, which we believe now. I think many people believe that this was an incorrect angle to take, that Uranos does not really connect to Varuna, and we have shown that Uranos connects to Dyέως mythically, by far the most. Nonetheless, he's trying to find a Mitra who would go along with his idea of Uranos as Varuna. So he says, Uranos does not form a couple with any other god. Beside this terrible king, this binder with his irresistible powers of seizure, this chaotic creator, we find no ordered, law-giving, organizing sovereign on his mythic level. It is true that such a sovereign does appear later in the story, Zeus, but he does not come as one part of a couple to balance Uranos, not even in the same way as Numa balances Romulus. Instead, he comes to abolish his predecessor's mode of activity forever, to begin a new phase in the world's life, one in which the powerful whim of Uranos will no longer have a place, either as driving force, model, or object of worship. So, in what measure are this Zeus and this Uranos, the one the luminous sky, and the other the night sky? So Zeus is that luminous sky in this framing. The one a warrior with his thunderbolt, and the other a seizing and binding magician. The one, I'm not sure what the word is, even though Prometheus would disagree, and the other chaotic, the one merely superhuman, and the other monstrous. In what measure are they heirs within a quite different theological framework of the ancient balanced couple, whose Indo-European antiquity is so amply underwritten by the Roman and Indo-Iranian evidence? In his defeat, Uranos was hurled into the dark reaches of fabulous times, and thus, as it were, beyond us, whereas Zeus lives on with us, among us. Is this difference of framework equivalent in some way to what the Indians mean when they say that Mitra is this world, Varuna is the other world? It would not be the first time that relations in space had evolved and had been reformulated into relations in time. But then he takes this back. He says this can't be correct. There are problems. He says we are assured, however. But I want to say he's also. It seems to me that he's being a little bit. I'm not sure the word performative. He's performing skepticism of his own conclusions there. in a way that suggests he's just not quite sure one way or the other. He says, "We are assured, however, that Zeus." Let's see. Excuse me. That Zeus and the living religious concepts of Greece in their entirety are essentially formed of a substance that is Aegean and not Indo-European. So again, he's saying we are assured. It sounds this is a passive formulation of his language. He's describing sort of how other scholars have assured him, and so he is taking this assumption that perhaps Zeus may just be Aegean and non-Indo-European. What to me seemed to have come from Indo-European fund can no longer be regarded as more than fable, matter for literature alone, not for worship. Here, Uranos, there the centaurs. But no, those everyday monsters embodied in processions are not the centaurs, only satyrs and silens, and Uranos is now nothing more than the figurehead of an academic cosmogony. We must not, therefore, search for any simple relation between the fossil Uranos and the living Zeus. Above all, we must not suppose too hastily that Zeus could have acquired, like Mitra in Iran, a warlike appearance and a lawyer's soul. The object of my present investigation no longer has any existence in Greece, since no form of Greek mythology or society is any longer articulated by the Indo-European schema of the three social functions or classes that were present in India, Iran, and Rome, and that are still recognizable in the Celtic and Germanic worlds. Zeus does preside over a divine hierarchy, but of a different type, probably Aegean. And then, let's see, what else? Perhaps a time will come when we will be able to make a probable distinction regarding not only the relations of Uranos and Zeus, but also those of Uranos and Oceanos, and of both with Kronos, between the Aegean data and the shreds of Indo-European material that have successfully survived around the names of the personages which are either certainly or probably Indo-European. Before the present, I shall pass by the temples of Greece without entering, consigned punishment, perhaps, for having explored them without sufficient prudence in my earliest forays. There will be occasion, moreover, to extend the inquiry beyond the Uranides later. Okay, so you can see he's being a bit melodramatic because he feels that he went too far with some of his Indo-European equations in his earlier work. He might be referring to his work on the centaurs and other material like that he found was not sufficient or conclusive or was incorrect later. And so he's kind of doing this dramatic, he's doing this sort of act of melodramatic penance for doing so. And because of that, he's giving in. He's saying, okay, Zeus appears like he could hold this Mitraic role. However, it must, people tell me, I'm assured that he may just be Aegean, and I can't really go farther because it's not really clear. So this may all just be Aegean material with only shreds that have been that are coming through of Indo-European. Okay, so what I want to say with that is you can see in this passage that there are two reasons he doubts himself in terms of Zeus being Mitra. And one of them is that he puts an intense emphasis and weight on there being a clear duality between the Mitra and Varuna. So because Uranos and Zeus sort of form a duality, but not quite, it's not really clear, they aren't really a pair, that makes him doubt that this is an Indo-European structure. Because, and then also with that, because Zeus isn't emphatically a lawyer, a legalistic god as much as Mitra is in the Avesta, because of that, it makes him doubt that Zeus is really just a Mitra. And then the second thing with that, of course, is that he is one of the things causing all these problems is that he has identified Uranos as Varuna. That dislocates the whole duality and causes it to appear that Zeus is not in this perfect dualism with the Varuna and makes him doubt furthermore. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense, because as we went into in our last stream, it is actually Poseidon who has the much stronger mythic and even name connection to Varuna and epithets of Varuna. Josephus went into how there's the Danunas Pati epithet, which connects the two gods, and then of course Varuna, and of course Poseidon as the sovereign, as the brother of Zeus, who is god of the waters. It is all very Varunian, and so if you fix that problem that Dumisil has, trying to incorrectly connect Uranos linguistically with Varuna, as he does, if you correct that and say, actually, Poseidon is the Varuna, then you have two brothers, Poseidon and Zeus, treated as sort of these sovereigns sharing domain of the world on the same level as each other. Even treated as almost flowing together, as Poseidon almost as the Zeus of the waters, that sort of concept. When you fix that structure, it makes a much clearer duality of the Mitra and Varuna type sovereigns, potentially, in a way that I think if Dumisil had accepted that and seen that more clearly, corrected that problem, he would have been more prone to say, wait a minute, there is a structure here of the dualism between the Mitra and Varuna types if you look at them as Zeus and Poseidon. And therefore, it may have made him question whether this was just Aegean material, and consider that perhaps it really was a strong Indo-European structure and a strong Indo-European core that is coming through in the brothers Zeus and Poseidon. Okay, so the point, the resulting point of that is that Dumisil, you can see here, Dumisil was going in the direction, he was intuiting that Zeus had a Mitraic kind of role, but then you can see him doubting and performing this penitential sort of act because he's not sure enough due to these problems that we described. So along with that, but I should say, there's no other god that he does suggest is Mitra type. This Zeus is the only one he kind of points his finger at and says, that kind of looks like Mitra. So that in itself is interesting. So along with that, I want to go to ML West, and we'll see what he has to say on this exact topic. Okay, so give me one moment. Okay, so many, I have a lot of documents here. So Emma West makes a similar kind of framing, where, and I think this is important to do also with when you're looking at Zeus, is that it is important to acknowledge that there may be Near Eastern influences on Zeus, syncretisms and conflations, but to take seriously that there also seems to be this core Indo-European god, and that god is of this sovereign type. So in Greece, this storm god's functions have been taken over by Zeus. The poetic attributes of Zeus as the storm god, as well as some other features of his image as exalted ruler, show the influence of Near Eastern poetry and theology. But the starting point was his celestial nature. So celestial, that meaning the sky. So you have, then if you look at celestial, you're looking at the sky itself or the sovereign of the sky, which would be the Mitra and the Mitra Varuna. Most of the formulaic epithets applied to him in epic verse refer to this. Cloud gatherer, thundering on high, god of lightning, delighting in the thunderbolt, he of the dark clouds. In other texts, he appears as the source of rain, also the unclouded sky and the fair wind. At Rome, Jupiter likewise enjoyed sovereign status, but his original connection with the sky has left traces, especially in the poetic language. In most obvious characteristic of the sky, apart from its brightness, is its vastness. In the Rig Veda, big, great, is a frequent epithet of Dyāw, heaven. So that is Dyāws, of course, or Dyā. And in a few places, it attaches to Dyałs as a divine figure. So here, MOS goes through the general traits of sky, which are indeed attached to Zeus or found in poetic descriptions of Zeus. And so I want to emphasize that we are not saying that there is no overlap between the sovereign of the sky, that is the Zeus type, and the embodied sky itself. Of course, there's going to be overlap on the boundaries. You could say there could be 10% overlap. There could be however much percent overlap. But we should be able to see the overlap of the domain of the sky. We should be able to see that separately from what is the actual core god type and the narrative myths. What do the narrative myths suggest is this core god type? So MOS, first of all, goes through the qualities that Zeus has that connect him to the sky and that therefore overlap with Dyałs, indeed. But after he does that, he shifts and he starts to say, aside from these things, Zeus actually aligns with Mitra Varuna in a lot of what he actually does. Okay, so I will pull up my next slide here to demonstrate that. Apologies for the slow switching here, but here we go. Okay, so with Dyałs, these appear to be fragmented survivals of an Indo-European complex of ideas. Indic Dyałs is all-knowing. And then he says, in India, it is another god of celestial nature, Varuna, or the pair Mitra Varuna, that supervises justice. So he's noting that Zeus indeed supervises justice along with this all-seeing power. And so he says, he supervises justice, oaths, and contracts. Varuna too is Vishvadevas, and wide of eye. He has watchers who come hither from heaven with 1,000 eyes. They watch over the earth. The all-seeing sun is sometimes identified as the eye of Varuna or of Mitra Varuna. Okay, one last slide on this in this particular passage. So he sort of concludes, after looking at the Dyałs and Mitra Varuna as possibilities, says, how does this all hang together? The eye, the wide vision, and the myriad spies that the Greeks ascribe to Zeus are ascribed in the Indo-Iranian tradition not to Dyałs, but to Mitra and Varuna, or in Zoroastrian doctrine, to Mithra and Ahura Mazda. The critical factor is the allocation of responsibility for the supervision of justice and righteousness. Whichever god assumes this function is furnished with the appropriate apparatus of eyes or spies. It is hard to say which was original. Mitra Varuna are certainly an old established firm already attested in the 14th century treaty between Hatti and Mitanni. It would not be difficult to suppose that as Zeus grew in importance among the Greeks, he took over the supervision of justice from another celestial god or gods who faded out of sight. On the other hand, the deified sky Dyēws was from the beginning suited to serve at least as witness to oaths and treaties. He appears in the role at Rome under the name of Dies Fidius, Dies being Dyēws. This god's temple on the Quirinal had an opening in the roof because oaths had to be taken under the open sky. Sub Jove. The Luwians had a Tiwaz of the oath. This is the sun god, but the name, as we have noted, is a derivative of Dyēw. We see how easily heaven and its dazzling focal point, the sun, can take on similar functions. The commonest Greek form of asseveration is by Zeus, or in a negative sentence, etc. A more emphatic expression is this, and let Zeus know it. That is, let him take note of my affirmation and hold me responsible for it. It is the all-seeing one. It is as the all-seeing one that he is thus invoked. let Zeus know it, he who sees all things at all times. There is perhaps a Germanic parallel in the Hildebrandslied, where Hildebrand begins a speech with the words, Vetu Irmingot Obana ab Huene. One of the more attractive of many interpretations proposed for the Vetu is that it is an old third-person imperative, so that the sense would be, let Irmingot know it from above in heaven. Okay, so you can see that M.L. West is not able to explain Zeus except by combining the sky traits with actually the sovereign roles otherwise associated with Mitra, connected to his powers of justice in particular. Okay, so that is to summarize the point that other scholars have pointed in this direction, and that we are not just making this up. So what is fascinating to me is also that Dumézil actually provided the foundation to take the next couple steps in understanding this problem, but he didn't go all the way, I think, in my opinion, to fully connect Zeus and Mitra. He didn't go all the way, but he provided the framework to reconstruct the Mitra type in the first place. And that is what you have to do. That is what we have to do, and have tried to do, is to reconstruct the Mitra type, because again, it is seemingly diminished in the Vedas, so you cannot use that as a core basis for comparison. You have to reconstruct what the Mitra type would have looked like, at least at the Indo-Iranic level. And from there, you can, if you have that as an anchor, you can reconstruct more broadly to the European branches using other examples. So what Dumézil did in this direction is that, building on the work of Stig Vikander, of course, he showed that we have, first of all, the Aveston material, where Mitra is much more fully formed. He is a combatant. He is connected with sovereignty and also victory, and with enforcing contracts and enforcing justice. He is connected with conquering and with sunlight and all of these things. And so we have much more material of him as this fully formed, full-bodied deity there. But along with that, he and Stig Vikander showed further that we have a very strong, very fleshed out example of the Mitra type in the legendary heroes of the Mahabharata. And as we mentioned in our last stream, this is the Pandava named Yudhishthira, who becomes the sovereign, becomes the all king, the overruling king, so to speak. So Yudhishthira is the incarnation of the god Dharma, as the text of the Mahabharata itself notes. And in one of my favorite, in one of sort of the funniest moments of Gods of the Ancient Northmen by Georges Dumézil, he explains this by saying that Dharma, which he translates or interprets as meaning law, Dharma is clearly, or is obviously rather, so Dumézil says Dharma is obviously a new version of the god Mitra. So this is a slight leap. It's an intuitive leap that he makes by interpreting what he's seeing with this god Dharma. And he says, well, that's clearly just another name for Mitra in this later, newer version of things found in the Mahabharata. And therefore, Yudhishthira is actually a preserved version of the Mitra type. Now, if you follow that and test that out, and I think he is correct ultimately in this leap, because it is a leap, because in other parts of the Indian tradition, Dharma equals the god Yama. Yama is the one who has the epithet Dharmaraj, the Dharma king, and is equated with Dharma. However, what Dumézil is suggesting is that Yudhishthira as a hero preserves a time frame in the pantheon much earlier, going back at least to the 1800s BCE, the Indo-Iranic period, where the Proto-Iranics and the Proto-Indo-Aryans, the Proto-Vedics were in the same place as unified before splitting apart. And so he's saying that on this deep level, this hero Yudhishthira actually preserves a Mitra type hero, and therefore a Mitra type mythos, even though the name Dharma kind of slips in later in other parts of the tradition. It slips and changes hands to denoting the Yama type god much more so, and that could be because the Yama and Mitra type have points of connection and overlap themselves. But nonetheless, what has to be kept in focus is that Yudhishthira appears to embody actually a Mitra type that's been preserved from an earlier time, even earlier than the Rig Veda. Now, what's interesting about this is that you can then set up these three data points side by side, which are Mitra of the Avesta, where he is a full-bodied combatant / sovereign deity. You can then set up Yudhishthira, where he is once again a combatant, overking deity, fully formed, very fleshed out. And then the third data point being the Rig Veda Mitra. And in the Rig Veda, he's much more diminished. He's much more pacified in Dumasil's framing, disarmed. He is much more present as just the other side of Varuna in the compound Mitra Varuna. And so when you set these up side by side, the Rig Veda Mitra is the outlier in that sense, because he is. It seems that something has happened to sort of diminish his role. What that suggests, by triangulation, you should be able to put these data points on your sort of chronological map and triangulate them together. And the deduction that follows naturally, in my opinion, and that Dumasil suggests, is that indeed the Rig Vedic Mitra is what has changed the most in that respect. The Rig Vedic Mitra has been diminished, and the Yudhishthira hero and the Avestan Mitra, they preserve much more clearly the original concept of the Mitra type. And so therefore you can kind of look at them side by side and see their commonalities, and that gives you a picture of what the Mitra type looked like on the Indo-Iranic level around 1800 BCE or thereabouts, perhaps earlier. And so that gives you sort of an anchor point to understand this quote-unquote lost mythos of the Mitra type. The Rig Vedic material can be helpful. You can bring that in as further evidence, but it is incomplete. Something has happened where it has become an outlier in these three examples of the Mitra type in the Indo-Iranic sphere. Okay, so Dumasil gave us that framework to work from, and from there you can extrapolate further, as we have done, showing that Mitra and that Yudhishthira in particular has all these myths that actually parallel, for example, Lu of the Celtic sphere, doing many of the same things within the myths, and then all three of those together have strong parallels to Zeus. So once you get from Yudhishthira and Iranic Mitra over to Celtic Lu, which can be gone into further, you can then see that actually perhaps the strongest mythic parallels to Zeus that are very clear-cut are between Lu and Zeus. And that is only understood why that is the case once you have put these steps in place to actually take seriously the need to reconstruct the Mitra type. So again, I want people to take seriously that there is a problem when you just try to directly look at the Vedic material. There's a problem there, and the problem is you actually need to reconstruct the Mitra type first. Otherwise, you're never going to see the full picture, and you're never going to come to what I think is the correct conclusions. Okay, so that is the long-winded groundwork. And would you guys like to comment on any of that, or add to what I said on those particular points, or let me know if that made sense or if I missed anything?
We'll have to bet, since you just recently were talking about the Harmadeva being Yama, but Dumaziel identifying it as clearly Mitra, quote unquote. That overlap between Mitra and Yama is something that happens with in Iranian mythology as well, where you have in the Shahnameh, which is their like heroic epic poem, kind of like the Iliad or medieval Irish poetry, you have Jamshid in the place of the Mitra type in I think like maybe a couple myths, and Jamshid means like shining or bright Yama. Um, and then
Right.
Hades himself being called like Zeus Chthonios, but so that's something that's pretty common, and
Mhm.
it's just also highlights the importance of mythic narratives being the most important thing to look at when comparing deities, since these change less, regardless of if language changes or if other things about culture change. The actual mythic narrative points change so much less than every other metric you could use, and are the most important and should be used if you're going to compare deities like this.
Exactly. That's a great point to drive home again and again. Definitely my project and our project, as we've worked together, has been sort of realizing more and more the importance of the mythic narratives, that you really have to understand them. And yeah, a lot of the problems with identifying Zeus, like identifying Zeus with the name of Dyaush, identifying Zeus with just traits of the sky. Those are sort of wishy. Those are sort of floaty, so to speak. They could float between the sovereign and the sky itself. If you only base things on that, or even the lightning bolt itself, as we've discussed, because the lightning bolt can be passed around and is passed around to multiple different gods. If you just go with that, um, things are shifting. You're not understanding the full picture. If you find their actual narrative myths, those stay much more stable. Nothing in this study, nothing in this field is 100% absolute in that sense. Nothing is totally solid. Anything can change. So you're kind of like always testing things. But the narrative myths tend to be some of the most important to understand and most stable. Yes. And yeah, again, we use a holistic method, taking in all types of evidence and weighing them and constantly testing them. But the narrative myths are what is always being missed, it seems to me, at large, that result in these incorrect conclusions, I think. So.
The only other thing I would say is that um, where Dumaziel tried to look at Kronos and Zeus as a Varuna Mitra pairing and failed to see a pairing, but uh, there's obviously some kind of similarity there with them being like celestial um, sky gods, but it's like Yaush is like the larger, over encompassing celestial father, and I think that
Yeah.
I should bring up later when if we talk about the Mithraic birth from stone, the difference between that sky quality within Diaoshuranos
Mm-hmm.
and the Mitra type.
Good idea. Yeah. Josephus?
Yeah, I was about to say that even when scholars take, or even lay people take myths into account, they often do take the myth into account but fail to see the structure of the myth and always try to dissect the myth and try to find what elements are Indo-European, what elements are Aegean, what elements are Semitic, what elements are Egyptian, and they never try to see the whole picture, never try to kind of see the structure behind the myth. Dumézil was one of the few who really tried to find the structure and the framework as opposed to just dissecting myths. But then he accepted the conclusions of other scholars about Zeus, and this kind of sort of hindered his work on Zeus as a possible Mitra type, which is what we're trying to fix today.
Yes. Well said. Hmm. Yeah, yeah. So there is this question of Aegean stuff, and yeah, I think people go too far, throwing it all in the Aegean basket as Dumasil was doing. It's sort of a giving up, saying, "Well, I can't really find the clear Indo-European material." But yeah, we're trying to show there is a strong kernel, even though there are, of course, likely mixtures here and there. We are not denying that either, I think. Okay. what else? We've got so many points we could go into on this issue. I did bring up, one key thing we could do. I would say, okay, the two directions that I come at this are going to Lu, first of all, and pointing out the narrative myths there, and then showing, look, that is a strong Mitra that you can see pretty clearly. I think you can see Lu as Mitra quite clearly. His name even means, like oath, most likely. The main candidates for Lu's name are Oath or Light. Okay, these are very Mitraic names, either route you pick. And then you can see very clear narrative myths aligning with Zeus from there. So much so that it's like just the strongest, like I said, parallel that I've found, at least. The other direction we could go is going through. I have 5 to 10 epithets of Zeus we could look at, which that show the Mitraic role right there in his epithets. So should we do that first, do you think?
Yeah, we can do that.
I mean, we could start with Lu, or if you want me to take the Orphic and Homeric hymns, I have them ready. So either way.
Okay. Okay. Yeah. Let me just read these epithets, and I'll get your guys' feedback on these. Okay. One moment. So again, Zeus has so many epithets and so many roles that it's almost like perhaps the Mitra aspect is just being missed in all the noise and all the names and stuff. But they're right there. The titles and epithets, which specifically can really only be described as Mitra type roles, they're right there in his names, in my opinion. And so, once again, to give an idea, Mitra is the god who embodies the oath or contract. He is the contract himself, and therefore ensures it. He also is connected to light and the sky. He's connected to assemblies. For example, in the Mihir Yash, the Mithra hymn of the Avesta, he is the chief of assemblies among chiefs of assemblies, and he is also catching the lyre with his long arm. So he's like the long arm of the law in a sense, because he's the lawful sovereign, once again, as Dumasil says. And he Dharma is the word that Dumasil interprets as law. So in a sense, Mitra embodies and personifies the law. Well, Zeus has one of his epithets is nomos. Nomos means law, and nomos is a personification of law, described as the ruler of gods and men. And this is found in Pindar, fragment 151, and then see also Plato's Gorgias and the Orphic hymn 63. Okay, nomos. Zeus has the epithet Asbameus, Asbameus, and this was an epithet of the Greek god Zeus in his persona as the protector of the sanctity of oaths. That's quite specific and quite literally what Mithra or Mitra is. Horkios or Horkius, Horcius or Horkios, is an epithet indicating the god who watches over oaths or is invoked in oaths and punishes their violation. This occurs chiefly as a surname of Zeus, under which the god had a statue at Olympia. This is in Pausanias 5.24 and Euripides. What is that? Hippolytus? What is Euripides? Hippol. What is that? Do you guys know? One of Euripides' plays Hippolytus or something. Josephus, you're supposed to know all the Euripides plays.
Well, how do you write the plays?
What's that?
How do you spell it, basically?
Hippol.
Okay, this doesn't sound like a Greek name, like the final. Maybe it means Hippolytus.
Yeah, Hippolytus.
Hippolytus.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. It's just his play Hippolytus. So Euripides Hippolytus 1025 is where that epithet is found. Okay, and then Jupiter has epithets such as let's see, jurarius or urarius, meaning of oaths, and it seems to be a word connecting to juror. Maybe would that be true? Urarius.
Yeah, basically the jurors are sworn into their office, so that's why they're called with this name, which would come from Latin jurator, English juror, as opposed to jurarius, which is more of a generic adjective, so related to swearing, without implying that he swears anything. Obviously, he's a god, so he's not the one swearing usually.
Okay, good. And then also Jupiter Hospes and Zeus Zenios. These refer to hospitality roles, which both Zeus and Jupiter have, which could connect to this sort of social glue concept connected to Mitra as sort of the one who binds together the society and promotes friendship and contracts, things like that. And then you have Jupiter Lapis. Josephus mentioned this one previously. Jupiter Lapis is a god of oaths whose symbol was a piece of white flintstone thrown on the ground by the oath swearers. Then we have Zeus Areius, Raeius, a cultic epithet of the Greek god Zeus, which means connects him to Ares, actually. So this could, let's see. Okay, so that could just be his more warlike aspect, not necessarily pertinent here. So then it says that, okay, so this is from Wikipedia. It's a summary of that epithet. It says, in reality, ancient Greek kings of the Molossians would sacrifice to Areius at the city of Passaron and exchange oaths with the people over which they ruled. The king swore to uphold the laws, and the people swore to defend the kingdom from threats. If the king failed to live up to this oath, the people would be relieved of their obligations here, and so throughout history, we would sometimes see kings removed for this failure. Okay, so just another strong connection to oaths. We then also see Dyēws Fidius as an aspect or title connected to Jupiter, which we could go into further. And this Fidius comes from, I think Josephus said in the last stream that it comes from fides or something. Does it come from the word fides?
Yeah, fides, which is probably an innovation within Latin language based on an Indo-European root, which means to be persuaded. And so in Latin, it kind of takes the meaning of to trust or to believe. And in Greek, we have related words, usually meaning something like to obey, but we also have the noun pistis, meaning faith.
Right, faith. So then we see that Zeus acquires, in post-Roman times, seemingly, Zeus acquires the epithet pistios, which Josephus has explained to me. I think it seems to be that this is just formed on the title Dyēws Fidios, so sort of borrowed back onto Zeus, showing that they saw that as a fitting title also for Zeus. I think, is that what happened?
Yeah, precisely. I think our only source for Deus Pistios is in the works of Denis of Halicarnassus, who is a Greek historian, writing in Roman times in Greek language, but fully integrated in Roman society. And so he's kind of trying to translate the epithet Dyēws Fidius into something that Greek readers would understand more easily. So yeah, it's definitely borrowed back from Latin into Greek, but still it definitely shows that it was seen as something reasonable in the eyes even of Greeks of that time.
Exactly, that they saw that it did reasonably apply to Zeus. So then we have like Hetereus, the protector of companies or associations of friends, a surname of Zeus to whom Jason was believed to have offered the first sacrifices. And that's in, I can't quite tell what that source is. It says Athene 13. So
okay, that's probably Athenaeus, who wrote basically a book with plenty of unusual kind of quotations from earlier authors. So that's probably it.
Okay, thank you. So so that, again, Mithra is chief of assemblies, and also Mithra comes to mean friend. He's this promoter of friendship by the binding of contracts and that sort of thing. So it applies there. Homagyrios, or Homagurios rather, is an epithet meaning god of the assembly or league, a surname of Zeus under which he was worshipped at Aegium. Under this name, Zeus was also worshipped as the protector of the Achaean League, and that's in Pausanias 7.24. Okay, so once again, god of the assembly. That is clearly a Mitraic, possibly Mitraic role, and also applies to Lu himself. We see him connected to the assembly. And even Mars Thinxus in the Norse sphere, Mars Thinxus, the thing being this assembly. And some scholars believe that Mars Thinxus is probably Tyr, who we will see. We'll hopefully go into Tyr being the Mitra of the Norse. And so that could apply to that role. Agoreus is another one connected to multiple gods who were considered to be protector of assemblies of the people in the Agora. And so this could be more of the marketplace assembly, I suppose, but it's another one connecting to assembly in general, I guess. We have Alastor, meaning avenger. So I think another important role of Mitra that can be missed is that he is indeed has an avenging quality. Even though he is this serene, pacifying deity, he still pursues vengeance against the broken oaths and that sort of thing. So it is interesting that Zeus is called Avenger or Alastor. And then, I think I'll just read right here. We have a summary of, let's see. Okay. No, I won't go into that actually. In the Mahabharata, we have, quote, when I think of his, that is Yudhishthira's wrath, O Sanjaya, and consider how just it is, I am filled with alarm. That's in Mahabharata Yoga Parva 22. So the point is, Yudhishthira embodies this wrathful justice. So he embodies justice, but he can be wrathful and in a very serene manner pursue and achieve vengeance, which ultimately brings about victory and peace. And that's kind of his role. Okay, so hopefully those epithets show that both Zeus and Jupiter have a very prominent Mitra role. And it's right there. I think it kind of gets lost in the sea of all his roles because he's kind of this totality sovereign. But you really can't put your finger on another god in all of Greek and Roman material that is more Mitraic, that has within him the Mitra role. If the Mitra role went anywhere, it is within Zeus and Jupiter, I think. It's pretty clear. So, okay, what were you going to say, Arno?
Avenging was interesting to me as it popped out as another late arriving. It's like justice that comes after the fact, but that was just a little side note.
That's true. That is true. He is about requital, which I always like to go back to Menelaus as sort of embodying this sort of ultimate getting sort of requital in the end. The whole Iliad story is about Menelaus pursuing vengeance, pursuing requital for his wife being taken away, and ultimately getting it in the end when he kills Deiphobus, for example, and others, whoever it may be, that he ultimately achieves victory and gets his wife back and all of that. It's all this allegory of the Mitraic justice by just vengeance. That's all. That's the only way I can say it. Okay. Would you like to just jump into? Oh, sorry.
Menelaus. Yeah, just
what was that?
One other consideration on Menelaus is that he also is a great host. So this kind of relates him to Zeus
right.
Xenios, right, as the god of the hospitality, even though then his guest kind of betrays him by kidnapping Helen and stealing the wealth that came with Helen. So this is also what prompts the Trojan War. And also let's remember that all Greek leaders had sworn to defend Menelaus' marriage. So this once again relates to another epithet of Jupiter, Zeus, So the idea of Zeus Horkeos, so the idea of Zeus as the god of swearing oaths.
Great
So
point.
yeah,
Yeah.
Menelaus is basically the clearest summary of all of these various Zeus epithets into one hero.
Yes, great point. Yeah, the oath of Tyndareus, I think, is what you're referring to, or all of the the assembled
Yeah,
chiefs.
it was probably invented by Odysseus, even though it was
Mhm.
Tyndareus who kind of
Right.
made it known to the other Greeks that it was an option, basically.
Right. And so that makes Menelaus this center point binding all the chiefs together. And so, yeah, he is he's sort of bringing it all together as sort of the embodiment. And then you see, as in the passage I went into last week on the Varuna stream, very important, when Menelaus is wounded during the peace treaty by Pandarus, he's shot by an arrow. It's made very explicit that in wounding Menelaus, you have trampled your oaths, your sacred oaths, underfoot. So Menelaus himself very explicitly is embodying the sacred oath of peace, the contract of peace, in that moment. And when he's wounded, it's the contract itself, the oath itself, is being destroyed and wounded. So he carries this mythos in himself very strongly. Along with that, it is very true also that Agamemnon can parallel Zeus because of this concept of Mitra Varuna, because the sovereigns are really two sides of one sovereign totality. So there are ways in which they both can, there are lines that can be drawn between even Agamemnon and Zeus, but we want to kind of focus in on this Mitra half because you have within the god pantheon, you have Poseidon and then you have Zeus. They seem to each take half of that sovereign duality, with Poseidon as Varna, Zeus as Mitra. But you have to see it in a complex way where because Zeus becomes the all sovereign, he is the final sovereign, other than like Dionysus perhaps getting a sovereignty passed onto him in sort of a latter, even later moment in some esoteric traditions, I think. You have Zeus as this sort of culminating sovereign, and because he culminates the sovereignty, he can have Varunian overlap as well with him. He himself can be Mitra Varuna all at once, in a way, because he's like the totality. It all flows into him, but it only does so because he's Mitra, first of all, if that makes sense. And what I mean by that is Mitra is the second half, or the second sovereign within the duality. Because he's the second half of the cosmic year, the ruler of the day is the second half of the cosmic year. Because of that, he's sort of the final one. And therefore everything flows into him as the totality. So that's why I always use the word culminating. He culminates the cosmic year, he culminates the sovereignty, and in that way he can everything becomes contained within him, including sometimes Varunian prerogatives. That is acceptable, that is understandable in this framework. So you have to be able to see the split between him and Poseidon, but also see this potential for Zeus to be all in all, I think, and that can be understood esoterically sometimes as Poseidon, Zeus, and Hades all being kind of part and parcel of one total sovereign, one Zeus, one ultimate Zeus, right? In some Greek traditions, right? Some Greek understandings of the material, at least. So you do have to understand Zeus as Mitra, nonetheless, and he even swallows Phanes before him, seeming to encompass the totality in that way, allegorically, symbolically, by swallowing Phanes and just everything flowing into him. Phanes, again, is like the Prajapati. So in a way, the Prajapati power, the Prajapati totality becomes encompassed even in Zeus. But I would like to argue that that is connected to the Mitraic role because it's the final sovereign. Okay. Would you like to go into some of the Orphic material, Josephus, or whatever hymns you had prepared?
Yeah, sure. Or even Homeric material. We do have a Homeric hymn that's actually pretty interesting, in my opinion. Here I have it. I don't know if the screen is being shared. Hopefully. So if you, okay, perfect. Okay, here we are. So this is actually very short. Many Homeric hymns are much longer than the only one actually to Zeus. Here you see the title is Hypaton Chroniden, so it means to the highest son of Cronus. It doesn't even mention Zeus in the title, but it's not really a problem here. What's really interesting is what it shows Zeus doing, right? So it begins, I will sing of Zeus, the best and greatest among the gods, wide seeing, powerful, the one who brings things to perfection, who basically talks. This is oaridze is talks as a verb, and oarus is talks as a plural noun. So he's talking, right? That's the sense, but the etymological figure here is hard to render in English. He's talking with Themis, who is sitting beside him, and he's talking deep talks, Bukinus Oarus. Now this is interesting because Themis is a goddess of justice and of what we might call tradition, more or less generally. So Themis is usually said, for instance, of religious rules, as opposed to maybe human laws, which are just called nomos. And Zeus and Themis are often paired together. For instance, in the flood narrative, in the Indian version, the survivor, Manu, prays to the couple of Mitra and Varuna for children. In the Greek and then Roman versions, but the Roman versions are just taken from the Greeks, the survivor Deucalion prays to Zeus and Themis. So probably there is some relation to the Mitra Varuna here. And so, well, then we have the invocation. So be happy, you wide-seeing son of Cronus, the most kudos having and the greatest. Now, this is a very important keyword here because kudos is often translated as glory or something along those lines, which doesn't really make sense. We do have in the Homeric epics the word kleos, which means glory. Kudos is more like the possibility to achieve victory, which is usually granted by Zeus, sometimes by other deities, which are usually the wives of Zeus. But generally, it's the ability to have victory, which Zeus can give or take away from the commanders in the Iliad, right? So it's definitely relevant that it was mentioned here. And it definitely reminds us, of course, of the Mitraic deities association with both sovereignty, war, and basically everything that could exist. Now we go to the Orphic material. Here we actually have 3 Orphic hymns, which have slightly different titles. So this is just to Zeus generically. Then we have one to Zeus Keraunios, so the god of thunder, and Astrapiu, so god of lightning. We have these various aspects of the same deity. And so let's have a look at this first Orphic hymn. Really interesting, especially because it says Martyrienti Temesta. So while other Orphic hymns usually are about praying generically, right, to the deity, maybe asking the deity to appear onto the worshippers, here the worshippers say that they basically bear witness, right? Martyrie means witness. It also gave rise to the Christian concept of martyr, but this is clearly not what was in the hymn writer's mind. So obviously he wasn't thinking of dying for Zeus. He was definitely thinking, however, of bearing witness. So it kind of reminds the audience or the users of this hymn about the close connection between Zeus and the legal system, the system of bearing witness, and so the system of being faithful, of giving a truthful speech and having a trustworthy speech, right? So that's closely Mitraic. Once again, we go back to Zeus for chaos and to obviously its Latin equivalent Jupiter, Iurarius, and this is very clearly Mitraic here. Then we have O Basileu, so O King. It's another very Mitraic trait, right? Zeus as the sovereign god, pretty much literally. Through your head, everything appeared easily. So the earth, the goddess, mother of mountains, and the high hills, and the sea, and everything that is contained under sky. So basically here Zeus is seen as a sort of universal creator. It's really interesting that the head is mentioned. Obviously, if you look at the Vedic material, the head is usually associated with the Brahmin class, so with what we would call, in Dumézilian terms, the first function. So it's really relevant that the head is mentioned here, and obviously elsewhere, obviously everyone would have in mind the myth of Athena being born from Zeus' head. So we go on. Zeus is obviously the bearer of the scepter. Now, the scepter is obviously not, or most likely not, an Indo-European original trait. It was probably spread from the Middle East onto other Indo-European cultures and beyond, but it's still very relevant, showing him as a sort of king, right? So again, it falls nicely within the Mitraic imagery of Zeus. Obviously, he's the son of Cronus, but that is pretty straightforward. Kataibata is possibly the most interesting word of this whole hymn, because it implies Zeus who goes down. And the obvious question is, where does he go down? Why does he go down? Is it referencing some specific mythic narrative? Is it maybe a naturalistic approach? So is it Zeus sending the thunder down from heaven onto earth? I will not give any definitive answers, but it's definitely worth looking at it. And then we have another really interesting and somewhat non-dual passage. So he is the getter of everything, the start of everything, and the end of everything. So we see the totalizing universal character of the Mitraic type. Once again, we have parallels for it even in India. I think that Dharma would be very fitting here. Then we have another interesting thing. He's called Sikton, which means earth shaker. Now, usually we see this kind of epithet associated with Poseidon, right? So maybe it's one of the aspects in which we see an overlap of Mitra and Varuna traits, and maybe the epithets of one can be shared with the other. And this is exactly what we see in the Vedas with Mitra and Varuna, so it's not surprising at all. It's actually very interesting from a comparative perspective. So we have Auxeta, so he's the god who increases things. And then we have Katarsie, the god who purifies. So what we said earlier is that Zeus is probably a deity who is related with keeping the social fabric together, with sort of allowing maybe people to be integrated into the Indo-European society, right? Obviously, Indo-European peoples had a very narrow concept of hospitality, so it was not open to everyone. It was usually assumed that you would be hospitable to people who are more or less of equal standing, right? So it's not exactly so straightforward. But another aspect of these keeping the social fabric together was the possibility of catharsis. So if someone was tainted by having committed a homicide or some sort of sacrilege, he could invoke Zeus, katarsios, so the purifying aspect of Zeus, in order to be reintegrated into society after having been purified of the miasma, so the sort of moral stain that came with homicide or with other sorts of sacrilege. Then he's obviously the god of thunder and lightning, and we can easily see that. And also of fertility. Putalie refers to the growth of vegetation. And then we obviously have the final lines in which the god is actually invoked. So hear me, you shapeshifter, and give. Obviously, it implies give us who recite the hymn. Blameless health, and the goddess peace, and the blameless fame of wealth. So he's basically being asked for health. Health should be understood in the classical sense of wholeness. So Zeus is kind of the god of everything. So he's the one who can make everything whole. And also as a sort of equipoise. So Zeus is the god who can basically make things equipoise, who can govern things well. And so this is health. Then peace. This is very relevant, I think. Obviously, peace is very Mitriac. Obviously, we do see Mitriac characters who end up in war and actually are even good at war. And I'm thinking of Menelaus, I'm thinking of Yudhishthira, but they obviously go to war only because peace was not an option. In the Trojan War narrative, Menelaus first goes on an embassy together with Odysseus, asking peacefully for Helen's restitution. Only once Helen's restitution is denied by Trojans, he goes on to fight in the Trojan War. So this is very relevant, I think, to defining the Mithra character. He's definitely ready for war if it need be, but definitely tries to value peace if it's possible.
Peace through victory. I always say peace through victory is sort of his quality. But like you said, he also tries to avoid it, and then he's ready for it.
Yeah, definitely. We should also keep in mind that peace in the ancient meaning usually was what came after war. It was not
exactly
really common to see countries that would not go to war for over 2 generations. It was unthinkable, basically, to the ancient mindset.
Yeah, so, and that's why Yudhishthira, he's terrifying when he finally comes to the point of having to pursue war. He may be peaceful and trying to be peaceful as a king, but when it comes to it and he is focused on the task of war or vengeance, he's terrifying. So he has that within him for sure.
So I guess we can also have a look at the other Orphic hymns. So these are maybe a bit more on the naturalistic side, but still might have something relevant to our discussion. Obviously, here this one begins with Zeu Pater. This is obviously what philologists always like to look at. We also find the same form in Homer, because obviously this is a good linguistic parallel to Jupiter and also to Dyέως Pitar, but obviously the linguistic parallel here does not necessarily imply a mythological parallel, and actually we have already argued for this. So you, Zeus the father, who brindle the high moving, fire shining world. So it's probably a long periphrasis to refer to the sky. Who thunders the utmost splendor, well, the highest splendor of the ethereal thunderbolt, who shake the seats of all the blessed ones with godly thunderbolts, who burns the seats. Well, it probably implies the heavenly seats. No, actually, no. It's you who burn the oh no, you would light up the thunderbolt with all clouded namas. He actually probably does not mean seed here in this context. Well, at any rate, we have long prefaces referring to thunderbolts, basically. So he's clearly invoked as the god of the Keraunos, and here the word actually pops up. So very naturalistic hymn on this side. Obviously, we have talked about the fact that Indo-Europeans probably did not have a single thunder deity. We definitely see that Greeks and Romans had multiple thunder deities. The Roman doctrine was sometimes attributed to Etruscans, but still many of these deities seem to be of Latin origin and not of Etruscan origin anyway. In Greek mythology, Zeus is pretty much the main thunderer, but we sometimes see Athena and Ares and other deities who basically borrow Zeus' thunderbolt at the times. So here we have other long prefaces referring to thunderbolts. Another interesting thing that this hymn has is actually this passage. So the earth and the sea is afraid of him when he shines thoroughly, and the animals run away when the ktupos, so the sound of the thunderbolt, gets to their ears. So the idea that he's a fierce sovereign, basically, and a universal sovereign. Here, the fact that he's a sovereign of both sky, earth, and water. Earth and water would kind of imply some sort of identification with Hades and Poseidon. That also fits very nicely with the idea of the three sovereigns being ultimately aspects of one sovereign, and this becoming even more explicit maybe in these Orphic passages, even though not thoroughly explained, kind of implied there. So what else do we have? Here we have other references to the sea. So he's still a deity who basically throws his heavy heart onto the sea waves and onto the highest parts of the mountains. And everyone knows your strength. So he's a sovereign without any opponent, basically. We do have myths in the Iliad in which coups are attempted against him and fail. So that's definitely the point of the Mythic sovereign as being the ultimate and absolute sovereign in Indo-European mythologies. And then we have the last part of the hymn, which as always is the one which is more explicitly concerned with the ongoing ritual. So basically it asks to be grateful for our libations, or rather to reciprocate in some way the libations, and to provide once again good thoughts to the mind, and blessed life, and the queen health. So once again, reference to health, as we said earlier. And then once again, the goddess peace. So same exact wording as we saw in the other hymn. We just see a couple more adjectives added on to peace. And a life always flourishing with wise thoughts. So here we have pretty similar petition as in the previous hymn. And then we have finally the third Orphic hymn to the same deity, which is somewhat more concerned with the aerial qualities once again. So he is the great, the holy. Now, holy is interesting, also reminds us of the priestly association of first function of Mitra in general. The loud thundering, the one who shows everything, the aerial deity, the fiery deity who runs through fire, who basically makes a sound through the air, who thunders, with his shining thunderbolt in the voice patagodromo is what does okay. I have to look up this one word. So it obviously means that runs through whatever patagos is supposed to be. Okay, so here we have it. Okay, clutch. So the voice that clutters as it runs through the clouds. Fearsome of the heavy mind, unconquerable holy God. Now this is really interesting. Well, Jupiter in Victus is also well tested among the Romans, so he's the unconquerable deity, the god who wins essentially, and this is pretty Mitraic as we have discussed already. Um, Zeus, the thunderer, begetter of everything, the greatest king. And so basically, I call upon you to bring a happy and sweet end of this life. So he's once again asked to make the life whole, but in very different terms, and especially with reference to the idea of teleute, which means end, both in the meaning of death, but also in the meaning of having an end goal, of giving a direction to these incarnations specifically. So this is the Greek material as far as we can see. So we definitely see some interesting Mitric traits. I don't know if we should go right onto the Roman material, or maybe there's anything else that needs to be said before that.
I think the Roman material would probably be a good idea. Yeah, that's the only other thing that comes to mind for me is there is some concept that in the Iliad, the power of Zeus at some point is notably connected to daytime, or even maybe restricted to daytime or something like that. But I don't know if you are familiar with that reference, or if I'm misstating it.
Yeah, I think it's about the passage where basically Zeus says not to intrude the domain of Nyx, the goddess of night. So it definitely does imply that Zeus is specifically related to daytime as opposed to nighttime.
Right.
It doesn't really say much more than that,
It's
comparatively
interesting.
wise. Yeah, I mean, it's
Yeah.
definitely interesting. Some people have tried to use it as an argument for him being a parallel of Dyέως, based on the idea that Proto-Indo-European Dyēws would be
Right.
some sort of daytime kind of word. But actually, in the Vedas, Dyēws is both day sky and night sky.
Yeah, I found
There's
specific.
no
Yeah, he is. I found specific passages where he's strongly the night sky, which I don't have at hand, but yes.
Also, by the way, this is paralleled by Uranos, who is the often called
Exactly.
Uranos asteroes, so the starry sky, the sky
Which is
obviously of the nighttime.
which is one of the main reasons Dumézil, one of the main supports that Dumézil used to try to say that he's Varuna, other than his name, trying to connect his name incorrectly to Uranos, to Varuna. He also brings in this starry sky, night sky aspect of Uranos, and then also that he binds at some point. But that binding is rather generic. It doesn't all add up, actually, and especially when the linguistics was actually flawed to begin with. And then when you realize Dyēws has these passages where he's very explicitly the starry sky, you can see that that's the connection to Uranos much more, I think. Okay, but would you like to go to the Roman material?
Of course. So I have the Roman material on hand. So I will begin with this quotation from Ennius, one of possibly the earliest quotations about the god Jupiter in a purely Roman context. And we already see a very interesting association. So we have O fides, you well, Alma is basically means the nourisher. So, oh, nourishing fides, uh, who are made able by your wings, and sworn oath of Jupiter. So obviously we do not have maybe the wider context of this verse. Obviously, most of Ennius' works only got to us through quotations out of context. But still, it's really interesting that we find fides, so personified trustworthiness, paired with the oath of Jupiter. Now, specifically, jus jurandum in Latin refers to the formula that is to be repeated by the person swearing. So in ancient Rome, pretty much as in other ancient civilizations, it was normal for the text of the oath to be spoken by a person and repeated by the person who was actually swearing the oath. So it was sort of a repetition, right? So the use itself, the formula itself, is jurandum. So it is to be repeated and sworn, right? So this is the first indication of a very close association between Jupiter, the Roman god, and swearing oaths. So on to another aspect of this deity was a sort of totalizing universal sort of deity, which is typically Mitriac, as we said. And we also saw earlier for the Greek Zeus. Here we have the only surviving fragment by an author named Soranus, who was put to death for divulging secrets of Roman religion. So nice. And this passage in particular is about Jupiter, who is almighty, omnipotens, who is the forefather and mother of kings and of history and of the gods, the god of the gods, one and all. So this is pretty much the most pantheistic and quasi-monotheistic. It's not really that monotheistic, but it's pretty much a non-dual passage in the most non-dual passage in Roman literature that we have on hand, basically. Here, Jupiter is sort of a universal deity. He is both male and female, and this is one of the ways that ancient authors try to convey non-duality for ancient deities. And he's obviously beyond the idea of number. Even Heraclitus, when he sort of gives an outline of non-duality, does not mention, I'm thinking of a specific passage in which he says that God is day and night and etc., but he does not specify that non-duality also is beyond number. It's pretty much implied and obvious, but he does not explicit it in the way that Soranus does it. And staying on topic, we also have the line, the famous line from Virgil, which is "Abioe principium musae jovisomnia plena." Now, this passage is very famous. There's actually some doubt about the interpretation because musae could be a genitive or a vocative, and this would change the translation. So the possible translations are: from Jupiter is the beginning of the muse, so of the song, and everything is full of Jove. If we interpret it as a vocative, then it basically means, O muses, from Jupiter is the beginning, and everything is full of Jove, so of Jupiter himself. This is once again a very non-dual passage. Here I'm looking at a commentary by Servius, who also quotes another verse by another poet, Lucanus, which pretty much is to the same effect. So Jupiter is everything that you see and everything by which you will be moved. And once again, Lucanus, the spirit, here to be understood in the pagan sense, so spirit was sort of the vivifying principle basically nourishes things from within, and the mind, which is spread through the limbs, moves the whole mass of the human body. So here we have these passages which once again point to a sort of absolute universal role of Jupiter as a sort of god of everything, god of the world, god of everything that is. That it's pretty much explicit in these passages. And this is once again probably a Mitric inheritance. Obviously, the influence of Greek thought was also possibly relevant in ironing out and maybe giving the right vocabulary for Romans to express this, but it's still possibly, in my opinion, rooted in the proper conceptions of Roman tradition, especially what might have been transmitted by the priestly colleges of Rome, which were so keen on transmitting rituals so precisely. So it's unlikely that they would have forgotten the real meaning of these rituals and the non-duality underlying them all. Going specifically onto Deus Fidius, here we have relevant passages by Varro, the author of pretty much plenty of books, but also specifically this is from the book on Latin language. So he discusses obviously Jupiter once again. He quotes basically Ennius once again, right? It should be, yes, it's Ennius, who has a sort of naturalistic view. So he says that Jupiter is what the Greeks call air, and which we call wind and clouds, and then rain, and then from rain cold, and then it becomes wind again, and then again air. So he is sort of having this whole convoluted way to say that Jupiter is a god of air specifically. And because of this, Jupiter is all of these things that I tell you, and that it helps mortals and cities and all animals. Now, helps in Latin is juvat. So obviously you can see the pun on juvat and the name Jupiter, and then the declension with accusative Joem, genitive Jovis, etc. So obviously this is just a pun. This is not a real etymology that we can certify with modern linguistics, but it's still definitely relevant to the ancient Roman perception of this deity. So obviously another quotation from Ennius, in which Jupiter is described as Divum cominunque pater rex. So he's the father and king of gods and men. This is very Homeric sounding. We see similar passages all throughout the Iliad and the Odyssey. So this is kind of a pretty quick discussion on Jupiter from Varro. What's interesting is that he also goes to look into the earlier names of the same deity, which are DyEØS, so with the original D that we also see in Sanskrit Dyέως and Deva, so it's the original sound, and Diespiter, which is basically another form of Jupiter. It's the same, etymologically the same word, and obviously reshaped by analogy, depending on which case was taken as the model for analogy. It's kind of linguistics, weird linguistic shenanigans, basically. So he goes on to discuss the words that are related to the name of this god. So obviously dies, which means day, and then dei, which means gods. Dyēws and Divum, which are clearly two forms of the same word, and presumably are equivalent to Proto-European Deivos. So Deivos which is in the Proto-Indo-European word for deity, and probably means something along the lines of shining or heavenly or anything related to this. And then we have the expression sub Deo, which in ancient Roman times meant under the sky, and obviously, or we should say in English maybe out in the open air, right, out in the open. And it was customary to swear oaths out in the open. And so finally, with this sort of chain of thoughts, the author gets to Dyēws Fideus, so the god of swearing oaths. He basically tells us that there was an attempt to explain Dyēws Fideus as Diovis Filium, so the son of Jupiter. Now, obviously, this doesn't really check out. We know that Fideus has a short e, well, short I in English, which is e in Latin, and not the long I of filium. So clearly, they are not the same word. They are not related words. Probably, maybe they are related in ways that we would not imagine. But Fideus is pretty clearly from fides, which means trustworthiness, and that's out of question. What could be questioned is whether use has a long or short vowel. So presumably has a long vowel, just like most of the other words that are mentioned up here. So the previous three words all have a long I, and this would be a very strong argument in favor of it being Dyēws. And since we have tur in Old Norse language, and also deva in Sanskrit, which is a common epithet for Mitra, both implying Dyēws, the long I in Dyēws is pretty obvious in my opinion, even though if you look back on West kind of tries to derive it from Dyēws, but it, in my opinion, not really solid linguistically. So we have an interesting discussion. Basically, Barrow does not really specify where, but it says that the roof of Jupiter was basically had a hole in it, was perforatum. Now, Varro doesn't specify it. We know that the temple of Jupiter on the Capitol had this hole in the roof, and it was intentional, right? It was not just a random hole. And Varro tries to explain it because it was necessary for seeing the Dyēw, which is the sky, and so this kind of was analogically appropriate to this deity. So obviously, Varro goes on saying that it was not appropriate, according to ancient Romans, to swear an oath under a roof. So if you had to swear an oath, you had to do it in the open air, you had to do it under the daytime sky, presumably so that the god could see you, and also everyone in your community could also see you and enforce obviously the oath that you had sworn, and keep track of your trustworthiness, of your ability to respect what you swore, what you would swear that you would do. So this is another work of no, we have looked at that already. Okay, here we have Festus, who gives us an interesting information, since he identifies Dyēws Fideus with Sancus. Now, Sancus, on linguistic grounds, is probably originally a deity from other Italic peoples that was whose name was borrowed into Latin, most likely at the very least. At any rate, the name Sancus is clearly related to the Latin verb sanctio, which means I establish, especially by means of oath, of course. So it's usually applied to religiously sanctioned rules. So Sancus, it was also identified as Semo, which is the god of strength. I think this is a secondary development. and it was possibly incited by Ilias Stylo, who assumed that Deus Fidius was a form of Hercules. But historically, Sancus and Deus Fidius were probably originally the same deity associated with swearing oaths. It's ultimately the daytime form of Jupiter as opposed to the nighttime form, which is called Summanus, as we have discussed earlier
So
in
that's
the Varuna live stream.
yeah. Sorry to interrupt. That's a key point about Semosancus and Deus Fidius being aligned there, because and specifically with the Hercules issue you pointed out, because there is sort of this debate still, which whether Semosancus, whether that is really just the Hercules type among the Romans, and then is Deus Fidius really the Hercules type, or is he actually, it's like which one is which? And I think I think Roger Woodard's book goes into a mythic parallel, which I know we discussed a long time ago. It must be like this, is it Semosancus and Hercules having some mythic parallel involving there's the let's see, is he going into a place with some women, and there's like the waters, like a fountain there or something, and he's breaking into this place. Do you recall what I'm talking about? That Woodard touches on.
Yeah, he touches on myths which could parallel those of Cuchulainn and other uh, types associated with the second function. So yeah, it's definitely possible that Semo was originally a god of physical strength, and the etymology is also on this side. So etymologically, Semo would probably come from the Indo-European root seg, meaning strength. Now, some modern scholars have tried to derive semo from semen, which means seed, right? However, seed is never explicitly associated with this deity. If it was associated with seeds, ancient Roman authors would have probably told us. So there clearly was no logical reason for this association to be made. On the other hand, we have Salus Semonia, which is the goddess of health. And so it makes sense for the goddess of health to have an epithet that relates to strength, right? So yeah, definitely. I think that the identification between Sancus and Semo is secondary,
Yeah,
whereas the identification between Sancus and Deus Fidius probably reflects an original identity of these two deities,
that's
possibly
fascinating.
Deus. Yeah, definitely. There's also in Umbrian mythology and religion a god called Thesaurus, which is probably the same as Phidius. He seems to be worshipped in as part of a trifunctional triad, so it makes sense for him to be the F1, the first function deity of this triad. So really fitting as well with all the other matriarch types in other
Right.
Indo-European religions.
Okay. All right. Well, that's great. Is that the final point on the Roman material? Do you have a last word on that?
Yeah, no, I think this is the final text that we are examining today from the Roman material. Of course, the wider picture is obviously that Deus Fidius is the daytime aspect of Jupiter, even though some authors try to envision him more like a sun than an aspect, but it's still comparably the same concept.
Mhm.
And obviously, this deed is closely associated with oaths, and there was the method of swearing an oath by throwing a white stone, a flint stone usually, um, which I think is parallel outside of Roman culture as well. At any rate, the swearing oath seems to be kind of the main issue with Deus Fidius, whereas the more universal aspects of the matriarch sovereign usually are transmitted under the name of Jupiter himself. And so we clearly see both of these sides of the Mithra coin, which are never really separated, clearly reflected into Roman mythology and religion. Now, just for the person who was asking me to spell the name of the deity, I think it's Fisovios. Uh,
Okay. Are you guys there? Okay.
All right. Yeah, I'm not sure what happened.
Okay, that's all right. Yeah, so that just to kind of conclude with that, I think that is very key because as we saw, Dumazil had some trepidation, had some questions about whether Zeus is really Indo-European even, and is he Mitra or is he just Aegean? And he was not prepared to say that Zeus was.
Apparently, my computer died when
Oh,
I
okay.
was speaking. I hope that the
Okay.
whole spelling. Okay, yeah, the spelling is Fisovios. It's what they wrote in the comments. So yeah.
Okay. Okay,
I
great.
don't know
Well,
if you were moving on to
I,
something else.
I was just
commenting
I
on
was
my
just summarizing.
Yeah.
I was just summarizing here, and you can jump back in if you have any further thoughts. But just that, Dumasil had a lot of doubts about Zeus. Is he Indo-European? Is there an Indo-European shred left there? But he, you can't take that too far. Or some people, I've seen critics or some skeptics take that a bit too far, as if Dumasil thought there was no Indo-European material here or there, because as you just went into, Dumazil very explicitly says Jupiter is Indo-European, and Jupiter is Dies Fidius. This aspect you pointed out, Dies Fidius, is this judicial oath associated aspect connected to Jupiter, and so seen as an aspect of him. And then he says that Sumanus, as we've I think mentioned in the Varuna stream, Sumanus is the nighttime aspect of Jupiter, Jupiter Sumanus, and connected to nighttime thunder and things like that, and that he is, and Sumanus is the Varuna. So these sides kind of make up the total Jupiter, who's just Jupiter. But nonetheless, the point is, Dumasil was very clear that Jupiter, with these two aspects, was Indo-European, and that he is, to him, he is Mitra Varuna. Essentially, he basically says that Jupiter is Mitra Varuna with some other things that could be influenced from Zeus or what have you. But nonetheless, those are the things that those are the aspects that he pinpoints in Jupiter. And you can't 100% say, oh, like Jupiter is the exact same as Zeus, therefore Zeus is Mitra Varuna, but you can't write that off completely either. You can't say like there's no similarity between what Zeus is doing and what Jupiter is doing. They're so similar and overlapping that we could see in that passage that just as Dumasil claims that Jupiter is a Mitra Varuna, total sovereign, he's also, it's sort of implying, he's also suggesting that there is something similar happening in Zeus, at least in terms of what his role is, and then he's just kind of doubting himself about how sure can you be whether this is Indo-European or not. But the point is, Dumasil was not skeptical about a sovereign skyfather in the Mediterranean in general, because he saw him in Jupiter blatantly, and he was just unsure if Zeus was exactly the same or a little bit different. You know what I mean? So hope that gets across. You can't take the Dumasil, in terms of Dumasil, he didn't take the skepticism all the way through to Jupiter. So he had that as kind of a clear vision. Okay. And then, along with that, he points out how Dyēus Fidius, this Mitra aspect of Jupiter, he's like a jurist aspect, but he also wields something called a fulmen, and maybe you can explain the fulmen more. But I think he pointed out that this fulmen connects to him. Let's see, authoring the contracts or something like that. But it has this connection to fulmination, like to a some sort of fiery aspect of what he's holding, his implement, and he connects that. Dumasil connects this fulmen of Dyēws also to the fact that the Mithra of the Avesta of the Mihir is the one who has the Vajra. So it is the same as Indra's Vajra in the Vedas, but instead in the Avesta it's wielded by Mithra. Mithra is the one, and people need to remember this and understand this, that in the Avesta, in this fuller picture of Mithra, he's the one wielding the lightning bolt weapon called the Vajra there with a Z. And then into Dyēws. Dyēws has this fiery aspect implement that he uses to Josephus. Again, you could explain this right after I'm done, but is it something that he is like creating the contracts with, or how does the fulmen work in your understanding?
Well, I think that actually more than creating contracts is the way to communicate with the mortal world, right? So ancient Romans had this sort of obsession with looking for divine signs in everything, and obviously thunderbolts which descend from heaven onto earth are pretty easily spotted as a symbol, right? So Romans kind of use it for divination, for instance, and obviously for religious purposes. They usually built a sort of enclosure, like a little stone enclosure around a point of the earth that was struck by a lightning bolt, and they called this enclosure fulguritum. And then they had a specific figure called Strufertarius, which literally means the one who brings the Strues cake and the Fertum cake, so a bunch of cakes basically, who brings cakes to this place for sacrifices. This was not one of the main Roman priests that were included in the state priesthood. But it was customary to have these people appointed to carry out sacrifices in places struck by lightning. Obviously, lightning could be thrown by different deities. So as a rule of thumb, daytime thunderbolts are from Dyēws, nighttime thunderbolts are from Summanus. We also have other deities who can wield thunderbolt, especially Minerva for springtime thunderbolts and Saturn for wintertime thunderbolts.
And this just shows that the thunder passes around. You can't draw just because Indra has the thunderbolt, it doesn't make Zeus the thunderer. You have to understand this broad array of thunder wielders across the path there, because Mitra in Iran has the thunderbolt, and not not Indra and not Verethragna, because it is Mitra who has it. And then in Greece and Rome, there are multiple lightning wielders. So it falls apart to just say Indra equals Zeus because thunderbolt. And then with the fulmen, the way Dumasil describes it in his book, I wasn't sure if you're supposed to be picturing Dyēws wielding like a fiery pen, that like the way he describes it is like it has been diminished from originally a thunder weapon to something more fitting to the jurist aspect. But what's your take on that?
So I don't know, maybe I'm not sure it's a sort of fiery pen. It's definitely fiery.
I probably read into that.
I guess it's a sort of pen in the sense that it kind of writes reality by its ability to give us premonitions and kind of tell us which is the will of the gods,
right.
Which is the will of Zeus or Jupiter, since we're talking Roman. So yeah, it's definitely comparable to a pen, but it's not the first or most precise comparison that I'm thinking of, basically, for the full mint.
Okay, good. Okay, yeah.
Also, obviously, Romans had pretty much the terminology, so we have plenty of other words from the same root as full men. We have fulgur, we have fulgetra. So these are all different shades of meaning related to thunder or to lightning. And there's a lot of material on that in Roman texts. We also know that Etruscan texts on the topic were highly regarded in ancient Rome, even though obviously very little from these Etruscan texts has made its way to us in the modern age.
Right. And then along with that, of course, Rudra has his arrows are lightning in the Veda in some places, and Varuna, I know there's a reference somewhere where Varuna is connected to wielding lightning as well. And so lightning, it's just not this stable single god power that some people want it to be, to simplify the picture. So that's why Indra doesn't really work as a mythic parallel one-to-one with to Zeus. You have to go further and look beyond Indra, because the lightning actually passes around. So Arno, before we go, I know we've been really focusing on the Mediterranean, and maybe next time, maybe we need to just dedicate next time to the Norse and Celtic mostly, if we can do another stream on this. But are there any thoughts you have on this, Arno, before we wrap up?
Yes, but they're all pretty long-winded. I think they'd be best saved for the next stream. Maybe we could open up with some of them.
Okay, that sounds great. So, and here's a summary kind of little slide here. So, theological functions of the Mitra type in general. He culminates all godly powers in himself, and that is because he is the god of the daytime half of the cycle. Once again, you have to picture the night half as the first half. The day is actually the second half, leading up to the final end point, which is the night to come, so to speak, the end of the cycle. And so the sovereign who is sovereign of the day is actually he's like ruling now. He, in our like the present is symbolically the day, and we are ruled by the god of the sovereign day, and that is Zeus. And so everything is culminating in him, because along with that, he is the late comer, and you'll see that with Lu. Why is Lu the late comer? Because he's the god of the oath, the god of the day sky, who brings it all together and achieves final victory. That is the Mitra role. That is what Yudhishthira very explicitly does in his legend, which you can decode and understand by comparison as actually this preserved Mitra. And all of that connects back to both Zeus and Jupiter. So the Mitra type also oversees all oaths, contracts, assemblies, law, and friendships. He unites all things together in that way, as the final totality. He holds society in a stable form and achieves victory, achieves peace through victory, as we said, giver of victory in battle. So the Mitra type is repeatedly connected to victory, as we'll see. We'll see more examples, I think, next time. But of course, Zeus is often pictured, or in statues and various connections. He is pictured with Nike, the goddess of victory, right? So that is that Mitra role. He is connected. Victory attends him. Mithra in the Avestan hymn is repeatedly shown with the embodiment of victory, which in that case has become called Verethregna. Verethregna is the destroyer of obstacles, but also it comes secondarily to mean victory. And the Mitra type also, multiple instances, once you understand the excuse me, I can't speak anymore. Once you understand the pattern of the Mitra type, he is frequently the thunderbolt wielder, actually. Just because Indra is the most prominent one that you know of and that we know of, in our minds, that doesn't mean other god types don't wield the thunder, because they do. And once it can be shown that Lu is the Mitra type, he also wields a spear, a fiery spear that seems to be like a thunder symbol, or a lightning symbol rather. And then Zeus and Jupiter can be shown by their mythic narratives and roles and epithets and their position in the pantheon to actually be Mitra or Mitra Varuna aligned, and they are thunder wielders. Mithra in the Avesta is a thunder wielder, and so forth. So you have to get the full picture. You have to create the whole picture to see that actually the thunderbolt wielder is more than once, is frequently a Mitra type, or a Varuna type, or Mitra Varuna type. And that makes sense if you think about it. If you think about the role of the sovereign, right? He's ruling the sky. He is connected to the clouds of the sky and what they bring. And the thunderbolt itself is a symbol of power and divine power, wrath, justice. Everything can be centered in the symbol of the lightning bolt. And so it shouldn't be surprising that he can wield the lightning bolt if he wants to, and if a given tradition depicts him in that way. If a given tradition has not minimized the Mitra role like the Vedic one does, then it naturally follows that the sovereign may wield the lightning, I think. So I think one of the only reasons that Mitra does not wield the lightning is because he has been diminished. And therefore the secondary, the second function, warrior god Indra, has been elevated. And so therefore him as the one and only seeming lightning wielder becomes more prominent in the mind, in the minds of the Vedics and thereafter. But yes, it makes sense. We see the sort of struggle for the control of the lightning, even, I think, in the story of Lu and Turin, which I think hopefully we'll touch on next time. But Lu, the sovereign, the Mitra type, forces the sons of Turin, and Turin may indeed be the thunderer himself. He forces them to retrieve for him a fiery spear, which may be like the it's like, okay, the thunderer has the specific role of controlling the thunder. That's he's the warrior. He's second function, though. He's not I'm talking about in the Indo-European sphere. He is not usually the sovereign. He can become elevated to the sovereign, like as in the Vedic material. Indra comes to take a higher position, I think, but he is the warrior in general. He is sort of like the dedicated, focused, more narrowed thunderer. However, there is a sovereign above everything, above all the gods, and it makes sense that he also can control the thunder and can take it away from the thunderer, as we'll see in the Celtic story, I think, because he really has the control of the skies as a totality. And then the thunder himself is like the more focused specialist of the thunder. So hopefully that can make give a framework to think about the difference and how it can kind of switch between these types. And for that reason, Zeus and Jupiter are actually more Mitra once you understand these things. Okay, so I got to get going, and I hope everyone enjoyed the discussion. We hope to make a part 2 of this, again, going into Celtic and Norse material. There's just so much to go into, such an important god. So thank you guys for joining me and giving a lot of focus to this, Josephus and Arno. And I hope you guys can come back for the next part and we can get further into it. All right. Thanks to everyone for listening.
Yep. Thanks for having us. See you next time.
All right. Okay.
Thanks for inviting us. See you next time.
Okay. Thanks. Very good. All right. Bye.